Thanks, Terry, and thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about a brief overview of all of the SNF QRP quality measures. And to supplement the materials that are in your packet and that you have received and are posted, I just want to turn your attention to the SNF QRP website, the Measures and Technical Information webpage, where all of the details on the quality measures for the claims-based and assessment-based QRP quality measures are found. There are several appendices that I want to bring your attention to when you get to the Measures and Technical Information webpage as well, and I hope that they'll be of use to you after this presentation, which is a broad brush on the quality measures. As with all of the presentations, we have some acronyms for your reference. And the objectives of the presentation are to become familiar with the quality measures that are currently publicly reported in the SNF QRP, as well as those quality measures that are being updated or added for the 2020 reporting. To understand the key components of each quality measure and how they're used to calculate the quality measure, and understand the data submission requirements and reporting timeline for fiscal 2020 and the subsequent years. So the assessment-based quality measures have some key concepts that I wanted to go over with you. When I was learning quality measures, these were key concepts that were foreign to me. And many of you may already know a lot of these concepts, but I do want to review them or go over them for folks who are new to quality measures. The first for the SNF QRP is of an important concept, and that is a stay. Oops. My apologies. I'm eager to get through. A Medicare Part A stay includes consecutive time in the facility starting with the Medicare Part A admission record, which for the SNF QRP is a 5-day assessment, through the Medicare Part A discharge record, or death and facility tracking record at the end of the stay, and, where applicable, all of the intervening assessments. The look-back scan is conducted to review all qualifying reasons for assessment within a Medicare Part A stay, to determine whether certain events or conditions occurred during that stay. And the look-back period consists of the entire Medicare Part A stay specific to a resident. So as you can see, for the SNF QRP, for those of you who are familiar with the nursing home quality initiative measures, a stay is different in the QRP as compared to the nursing home quality initiative. Another key concept that's really important is the denominator. The denominator, although many of us, when we went to grade school and learned about numerators and denominators, and here it is back to haunt us again, is the total number of Medicare Part A stays that don't meet the exclusion criteria for each facility or each measure. The numerator, on the other hand, is the number of Medicare Part A SNF stays in the denominator that meet the criteria for the measure in each facility. The exclusion would be a Medicare Part A stay that's excluded from the measure if the exclusion criteria are met, and the observed performance is the unadjusted score calculated by dividing the numerator by the denominator. So it's a straight division, and then you get a fraction, and you multiply that fraction by 100 to get a percent. And then covariates are variables used to adjust scores for measures that are risk adjusted. Now that you have a better understanding of some of these concepts, let's get into a little bit more specific detail. When reviewing measure specifications, you'll often see a reference to a type of stay. There's a type 1 stay, which is a PPS assessment matched with a PPS discharge assessment. So you've got your 5-day matched with your PPS discharge and no death and facility tracking record. A type 2 stay is a SNF PPS 5-day assessment with a death and facility tracking record. So here's our first Slido. This is to assess your short-term memory. So, what is a type 2 SNF stay? Oh, what happened? We have actual Slido. Thank you. What is a type 2 SNF stay? A SNF stay with a PPS 5-day assessment and discharge tracking record. B, a SNF stay with a matched pair of PPS 5-day assessment and PPS discharge assessment. C, a SNF stay with a PPS assessment and no death in facility tracking record, and D, a SNF stay with a 5-day PPS assessment and matched death in facility tracking record. We have an overwhelming majority that says it's D. Let's look at the actual answer. You got it. Good short-term memory. Okay, so now let's take a look at the 8 assessment-based quality measures in the SNF QRP. The first 2 measures were introduced in October of 2016. They are application of the percent of residents experiencing 1 or more falls with major injury, and the application of percent of long-term care hospital patients with an admission and discharge functional assessment and a care plan that assesses function. The remaining 6 measures were introduced on October 1st of 2018. We'll be going over these measures in more detail. So starting with the measures that are not changed or are not new, the first is falls with major injury. This quality measure reports the percentage of Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF stays where 1 or more falls with major injury, defined as bone fractures, joint dislocations, closed head injuries with altered consciousness, or subdural hematomas, were reported during the SNF stay. For this measure, lower percentages are better, and data collection began on October 1st, 2016. So here we have a graphic of the calculation for the falls measure. The denominator, which we now know is the total number of Medicare Part A SNF stays that don't meet the exclusion criteria, is the total number of Medicare Part A Type 1 stays with 1 or more assessments that are eligible for a look-back scan. So with the denominator in mind, the numerator is the total number of Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF stays from the denominator with 1 or more look-back scan assessments that indicate that 1 or more falls resulted in major injury. Now, the look-back scan for falls includes qualifying reasons for assessments other than the PPS 5-day. It includes OBRA assessments, all of the A0310A item sets that may be in the look-back scan, the Medicare Part A PPS assessments that might be in that look-back scan period, the OBRA discharge assessments that might be in that look-back scan period, and a SNF Part A PPS discharge assessment that might be in that look-back scan period. And for this falls measure, there are exclusions if the falls with major injury are dashed or if the resident died during the stay. The next measure that we'll review is the admission and discharge functional assessment and care plan that addresses function. This quality measure reports the percentage of Medicare Part A Type 1 and Type 2 stays with an admission and discharge functional assessment and at least 1 goal that addresses function. Higher percentages are better for this measure, and the measure was finalized in the FY16 final rule, and MDS section GG0130 and GG0170 were added to the MDS in 2016. Data collection for the measure began on October 1st of 2016. So let's talk just for a minute about documenting function items, section GG items. And we often get a question about the documentation to support the item set coding for section GG. And the question is, what documentation is required to support coding of the resident's self-care and mobility abilities? The answer is that the data in section GG should be consistent with the clinical assessment documentation in the resident's medical record. And therapy and nursing notes may be used to support coding. We're now going to take a look at a graphic that outlines or identifies how the measure is calculated for this measure, admission and discharge functional assessment and care plan that addresses function. The denominator is the total number of Medicare Part A Type 1 and Type 2 SNF stays with a Medicare Part A stay end date during the measure target period. That makes sense. And for the calculation of the numerator, we add complete stays and incomplete stays. So as a reminder, a complete stay is a PPS 5-day, all of the required items for admission performance, at least one discharge goal in one self-care or mobility item on the PPS 5-day, and the completion of all of the required discharge performance data elements. That comprises a complete stay. An incomplete stay is also used in the calculation of this quality measure, which uses the PPS 5-day admission performance items, section GG, and at least one discharge goal for at least one self-care or mobility item on the PPS 5-day assessment. So let's go into a little bit more detail on what constitutes an incomplete stay. An incomplete stay is comprised of an unplanned discharge with a discharge date that is on the same day or the day after the end date of the most recent Medicare stay. It may be a discharge to an acute psychiatric or long-term care hospital with a discharge date on the same day or the day after the end of the Medicare Part A stay. It may be a SNF Part A stay less than 3 days, or if the resident died during the SNF stay. So a Type 2 stay, as we've already identified, is included in this measure. So we have complete stays, incomplete stays, and we have Type 1 and Type 2 stays for this measure. Okay, we have another Slido question, another short-term memory question. All of the following are determinants of an incomplete stay except A, death, B, SNF PPS Part A stay greater than 3 days, C, discharge to acute, psychiatric, or long-term care hospital, D, unplanned discharge. All right, I'm waiting for those votes to add up. Great. It does look like the overwhelming response for the audience is B, SNF Part A, PPS stay greater than 3 days. And now let's look at the answer. You're all right. Terrific. Okay, moving along. We have 4 new quality measures finalized in the FY18 SNF PPS final rule, for which data collection began on October 1st of 2018. We have change in self-care score, which estimates the risk-adjusted mean change in self-care score between admission and discharge for Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF stays. We have the change in mobility score, which estimates the risk-adjusted mean change in mobility score between admission and discharge for Medicare Part A Type 1 stays. We have the discharge self-care score, which estimates the percentage of Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF stays that meet or exceed expected discharge self-care scores. And the discharge mobility score, which estimates the percentage of Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF stays that meet or exceed expected discharge mobility scores. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into the change in self-care score measure. As we identified, the measure estimates the risk-adjusted mean change in self-care score between admission and discharge for Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF stays. There's not a simple form for numerator and denominator as there are for some of the other measures that we've encountered so far. The change in self-care score is calculated as the difference between the discharge self-care score and the admission self-care score. The target population is the total number of Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF stays, except those that meet exclusion criteria. The measure is risk-adjusted, and higher scores indicate a greater level of independence. So the exclusions include Medicare SNF stays that are incomplete, if the resident was independent with all self-care activities at the time of admission, if the resident had certain medical conditions such as coma, persistent vegetative state, complete tetraplegia, locked-in syndrome, severe anoxic brain damage, cerebral edema, or compression of the brain, if the resident is younger than 21 years old. The exclusion is for folks who are discharged to hospice or receive hospice care while a resident, or for those folks who did not receive physical or occupational therapy as reported on the 5-day assessment, or for those folks who are not Medicare Part A beneficiaries. There are 7 Section GG self-care assessment items used for the admission and discharge self-care score calculations, including eating, oral hygiene, toileting hygiene, shower, bathe self, upper body dressing, lower body dressing, and putting on and taking off footwear. Remember, these are going to be the admission and discharge performance items. So, for example, GG 0130A would be GG 0130A1 and GG 0130A3. In addition, response codes for this measure are very interesting. It includes response codes for the measure include the 6-point rating scale, the activity not attempted codes, and to calculate the admission and discharge self-care scores, we use a calculation procedure that adds up the admission or discharge scores. If the code is 07, 09, 10, or 88 on the admission or discharge performance items, then we recode to 01 and use this code as the score. In this case, for the measure, specifically just for the measure, if the self-care item is skipped, dashed, or missing, for the measure calculation, we would recode to 01 and use this code as the score, and then sum the scores of the admission self-care items to create an admission self-care score for each stay level record. And the scores can range from 7 to 42, with a higher score indicating greater independence. Are you with me? Okay, because we're going to see this calculation again. So for the change in mobility score, this measure estimates the risk-adjusted mean change in mobility score between the admission and discharge for Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF stays. Again, there's not a simple form for the numerator and denominator. The change in mobility score is calculated as the difference between the discharge mobility score and admission mobility score. The target population, once again, is a Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF stay, except those that meet the exclusion criteria. This measure is also risk-adjusted, and higher scores indicate greater independence. So I believe these exclusions should look pretty familiar. The mobility assessment items that are used, there are 15 of them. That's a lot of items that are used in the calculation of the measure. And they include roll left and right, sit to lying, lying to sitting on side of the bed, sit to stand, chair to bed to chair transfer, toilet transfer, car transfer, walk 10 feet, walk 50 feet with 2 turns, walk 150 feet, walking 10 feet on uneven surfaces, 1-step curb, 4 steps, 12 steps, and picking up object. And once again, for the change in mobility score, remember we're looking at the admission performance items and the discharge performance items. And once again, the response code include the 6-point rating scale from independent to dependent, the activity not attempted code, and for the calculations for admission and discharge mobility score, we use the same calculation procedure as we did for the change in self-care score. Remember though, since there are more items, the scores can range from 15 to 90. In this case, with a higher score indicating greater independence, because we have 15 items with scores to add up. Now we're going to take a look at another measure. We've just talked about change in self-care and change in mobility. And now we're going to look at the measure discharge self-care score. This measure is a comparison of self-care observed score and calculation of expected score. The discharge self-care score measure estimates the percentage of Medicare Part A Type 1 stays that meet or exceed an expected discharge score. The expected discharge score is calculated using intercept and coefficient values from a risk adjustment model, which includes resident stay level factors such as age, admission, function scores, primary medical condition, and comorbidities. We have here on this slide 31 an illustration of the calculation of the discharge self-care quality measure score. The denominator is the total number of Medicare Part A Type 1 resident stays, except those meeting the exclusion criteria. The numerator is the total number of Medicare Part A SNF stays in the denominator, except those meeting the exclusion criteria, with its discharge self-care score that is equal to or higher than the calculated expected discharge score. These exclusions, once again, should look pretty familiar. The functional outcome measures self-care items used for the discharge self-care score calculation include the discharge items, the discharge performance items in this case, GG0130A, eating, B, oral hygiene, toileting hygiene, shower bathe self, upper body dressing, lower body dressing, putting on, taking off footwear, and once again, this should look familiar. Response codes include a 6-point rating scale and activity not attempted codes, and similar calculations for the discharge self-care score that use the same procedure for adding up the codes for dependent through independent and recoding the 07, 09, 10, 88, skip, dash, or missing. So scores can range from 7 to 42, with a higher score indicating greater independence. The next measure is discharge mobility score. This measure estimates the percent of Medicare Part A residents in a Type 1 SNF stay that meets or exceeds an expected discharge mobility score. Expected scores are calculated and is risk adjusted based on resident characteristics, as we previously discussed, and higher scores indicate a higher percentage of residents that met or exceeded expected discharge mobility scores. So here on slide 36, we have an illustration of the calculation of the discharge mobility score. The denominator is the type of Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF resident stays, except those meeting the exclusion criteria. And the numerator is the total number of residents in a Medicare Part A Type 1 SNF stay, except those meeting the exclusion criteria, with a discharge mobility score that is equal to or higher than the calculated expected discharge mobility score. Look here, we have the same exclusions for this measure as we've seen in the previous 3 measures. And for the discharge mobility score calculation, we use the same items, which are roll left and right, sit to lying, lying to sitting on the side of the bed, sit to stand, chair to bed to chair transfer, toilet transfer, car transfer, walk 10 feet, walk 50 feet with 2 turns, walk 150 feet, walking 10 feet on uneven surfaces, 1-step curb, 4 steps, 12 steps, and picking up object. So the same 15 items. And this calculation should again look familiar. The calculations for the discharge mobility score do use the following procedure. Again, coding, if between 1 and 6, we use the code as the score. If the score is 7, 9, 10, or 88, we recode to 1. If the mobility item is skipped, dashed, or missing, we recode to 1 and use this code as the score. And then we sum the scores for the discharge mobility items to create a discharge mobility score for each Medicare Part A SNF stay. And the scores can range, because there are 15 items, from 15 to 90, with a higher score indicating greater independence. Oh, we got through some of those measures. Now let's talk a little bit about the basics of GG again, where we frequently do get questions. The question is, who should be involved in coding section GG self-care and mobility data elements? This is a frequently asked question and one I believe that many of you struggle with in your own facilities. The answer is that CMS anticipates that an interdisciplinary team of clinicians is involved in assessing the resident, and that resident assessments are to be done in compliance with your own facility policies, as well as state and federal requirements and guidelines. The RAI manual, however, does include the following guidance. SNFs should assess the resident's self-care performance based on direct observation, as well as the resident's self-report and reports from clinicians, care staff, or family documented in the medical record during the assessment period. All right, let's look at another measure for which we started data collection on October 1st of 2018. And this is the pressure ulcer injury measure, or changes in skin integrity post-acute care pressure ulcer injury. The changes in skin integrity post-acute care measure replaced the percent of residents or patients with pressure ulcers that are new or worsened in the SNF QRP. The percent of patients or residents with pressure ulcers that are new or worsened is no longer in the QRP, but continues to be available to accommodate the Division of Nursing Homes' adoption of the measure in the NHQI MDS 3.0 Quality Measure Program. Therefore, to obtain the information on these measures, you would have to go to the QRP data to obtain your measure scores for what is old to the QRP and new to the Nursing Home Quality Initiative. That measure information is available in the SNF QRP data. So as we're looking at the pressure ulcer injury measure transition, specifically for the SNF QRP, for the percent of patients or residents with pressure ulcers that are new or worsened, we started data collection in Q3 of 2018, and for the SNF QRP, it will be last on the provider preview reports for the quality reporting program in May of 2019, and the final display on Nursing Home Compare for the SNF QRP in July of 2019. However, because the measure was adopted for the Nursing Home Quality Initiative, you have to remember that we're still now looking at two different measures, one for the QRP, one for the Nursing Home Quality Initiative, so that the changes in pressure ulcer measure that was recently adopted will start to be reported for the quality reporting program, because we're here to talk about the quality reporting program, not the Nursing Home Quality Initiative. And the initial quarter of data collection for the new pressure ulcer injury measure was the Q4 of 2018. We'll not see it on the provider preview reports until summer of 2020 for display on Compare in the fall of 2020. The changes in skin integrity post-acute care measure pressure ulcer injury reports a percentage of Medicare Part A SNF type 1 stays with stage 2 to 4 pressure ulcers or unstageable pressure ulcers, did I say that? Due to slough, eschar, non-removable dressing device, or deep tissue injury that are new or worsened since admission. In contrast to the old pressure ulcer quality measure, the numerator for this ulcer includes new or worsened unstageable pressure ulcers. It's calculated by starting with the number of pressure ulcers at the time of pressure ulcer or injuries at the time of discharge, MO 300 B1 through G1, and subtracting the number of these pressure ulcer injuries that were present on admission at the same stage for MO 300 B2 through G2. It's a cross-setting standardized post-acute measure where lower percentages are better. We have a couple of coding tips for the or pressure injury measures. The MO 300 items are used for measure calculation. A pressure ulcer injury on discharge that is not coded as present on admission on the PPS discharge assessment is included as a new or worsened pressure ulcer injury. If MO300, for example, B1 through MO300 B2 is greater than 0, then a pressure ulcer injury is counted as new or worsened. There are some exclusions for the pressure injury measure that include missing data on new or worsened stage 2, 3, 4, and unstageable pressure ulcers, including deep tissue injuries at discharge, or if the resident died during the SNF stay. And the changes in pressure ulcer injury measure also have risk adjustment for G0170C, sit to lying, HO400, bowel continence, I2900, diabetes, and KO200A and KO200B, height and weight for the body mass index. And we have an illustration of the pressure ulcer injury measure here, in which the denominator includes the type of Medicare Part A type 1 SNF stays in the selected time window, except those who meet the exclusion criteria, and the numerator is the number of Medicare Part A type 1 SNF stays for which the assessment indicates one or more new or worsened stage 2 to 4 pressure ulcers or unstageable pressure ulcers due to slough, eschar, non-removable dressing device, or deep tissue injury compared to admission. So when coding MO210 and MO300, you want to determine if the lesion being assessed is primarily related to pressure and that other conditions have been ruled out. If pressure is not the primary cause, of course you don't want to code it as a pressure ulcer injury in section M. And if a pressure ulcer injury was unstageable on admission, entry, or re-entry, then becomes numerically stageable later, it should be coded as present on admission at the stage at which it first becomes numerically staged. However, if it subsequently increases in numerical stage, that higher stage should not be coded as present on admission. Now let's turn our attention to the measure drug regimen review conducted with follow-up for identified issues. This measure reports a percentage of Medicare Part A type 1 SNF stays in which a drug regimen review was conducted at the time of admission and timely follow-up with a physician or nurse practitioner or physician assistant occurred each time a potential or actual clinically significant medication issue was identified throughout the stay. Higher percentages for this measure are better, and again, data collection began on October of 2018. This slide of how the DRR measure is calculated may be a bit difficult for you to see, whether it's on written or on the slide, because this measure includes all of the items used in the DRR measure, 2001, 2003, and 2005. So, in calculating the measure, you would code the numerator based on whether or not 2001 was coded no or NA, did a DRR identify any issues, or if there was an identified issue during the drug regimen review, which would then move you to answering 2003, which would be, did the facility contact the physician by midnight of the next calendar day and complete prescribed recommended actions by midnight of the next calendar day? The measure also includes, on discharge, if N2005 is coded 1 or NA, did the facility complete a drug regimen review each time a potential or actual clinically significant medication issue was identified throughout the stay, admission through discharge? So we have a question here: how is the drug regimen review defined? A drug regimen review includes medication reconciliation, a review of all medications a resident is taking, and if possible, to prevent potentially significant adverse medication consequences. A drug regimen review includes all medications prescribed and over-the-counter, nutritional supplements, vitamins, homeopathic, herbal products administered by any route, and TPN and oxygen. I just want to bring your attention to the fact that there is a drug regimen review that's identified in the State Operations Manual, and the requirements for the State Operations Manual Appendix PP drug regimen review are different than those used in the quality measure. So don't try to compare them. And coding DRR, which staff members may complete the DRR? We get this question quite frequently. And once again, we have to say that each facility delivers resident care according to unique characteristics and standards, and self-determines policies and procedures for determining who may complete the DRR in compliance with state and federal requirements. So providers should refer to those state and federal policies and guidelines to determine who may complete a DRR. You have another question, but I'm running out of time. So I want to call your attention to the information that you have in your packet, and I want to proceed. So with respect to your longer-term memory now, which of the following is not a SNF QRP quality measure? A, application of % of residents experiencing one or more falls with major injury. B, SNF functional outcome measure, discharge self-care score for skilled nursing facilities. C, changes in skin integrity, post-acute care pressure ulcer injury. Or D, application of functional outcome measure, change in mobility among long-term care hospital patients. All right, we have an awful lot of people voting for D. I'm going to move right along. And the answer is D, good long-term memory. A few words on claims-based quality measures. There are 3 claims-based quality measures in the SNF QRP: Medicare spending per beneficiary, discharge to community, and potentially preventable 30-day post-discharge readmission measure, or PPR. The MSPB measure evaluates a SNF provider's efficiency relative to the efficiency of the national median SNF provider. Specifically, the measure assesses the cost to Medicare for services performed by the SNF during an MSPB episode. It's calculated as the ratio of the price-standardized, risk-adjusted MSPB amount for each SNF divided by the episode-weighted median MSPB amount across all SNF providers. As you can imagine, we could spend probably a little bit more time on this measure. For discharge to community, the measure reports a risk-standardized rate of Medicare fee-for-service residents who are discharged to the community following a SNF stay and do not have an unplanned readmission to an acute care hospital or long-term care hospital in the 31 days following discharge to community and remain alive during the 31 days following discharge to community. A question that we frequently get is, what is community? And for this measure, it is defined as home or self-care with or without home health services. For this measure, a higher rate is better. And for the potentially preventable 30-day post-discharge readmission measure, this measure estimates the risk-standardized rate of unplanned, potentially preventable readmissions for residents who are receiving services in skilled nursing facilities. This measure is currently suppressed on Nursing Home Compare. However, you'll still be able to see this data on your confidential feedback reports. I do have some information here about the potentially preventable readmission measure. We often get questions about this. Why am I not seeing this on Nursing Home Compare? This measure is currently suppressed and not available on Nursing Home Compare. However, you can see your data on your confidential feedback reports. Additional time will allow us to test to determine if modifications to the measure and the method of displaying this particular measure are needed. The additional testing will ensure that the future publicly reported measure is thoroughly evaluated, so Compare users will have an accurate picture of quality. While we conduct this additional testing, CMS will not report data for this measure until each SNF performance, as well as the national date, has been vetted. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you better understand why you're seeing 16s on your reports. The data is not reported. We're going to take a quick look at the data submission requirements, specifically for the assessment-based quality measures. In the SNF quality reporting program, for the purposes of compliance as well as the review and correct reports, the assessment-based measures have a data collection timeframe of January 1st through March 31st, with a final submission deadline of August 15th that allows you to evaluate your data and make any necessary corrections. It also allows you to review your processes about your quality measures to see if there's something that you may need to improve within your facilities before these measures are publicly reported. The second quarter is April 1st through June 30th, with a data submission deadline of November 15th. The third quarter is July 1st through September 30th, with a data submission deadline of February 15th. And then finally, the fourth quarter, October 1st through December 31st, with a data submission deadline of May 15th. For the claims-based measures, there is no additional reporting by skilled nursing facilities. This is another question that always has me guessing, and I think this illustration helps me to understand and hopefully will help you understand the reporting timeline for the QRP quality measures, particularly those that were implemented on October 1st of 2018. We began data collection on October 1st. In April, you started to see that data on your review and correct reports, right? Seeing any nods. Oh, thank you. Okay, great. For the quality measure reports, those will become available to you in fall of this year. In summer of 2020, as we've described earlier, you'll start to see those new measures on your provider preview reports, and on Nursing Home Compare, the initial display will be in the fall of 2020. So the SNF QRP quality measures are available under additional measures on Nursing Home Compare. I hope you have all had the opportunity to review your measures on Nursing Home Compare for the SNF QRP and found them. There are 4 intended purposes of reporting the quality measures on Nursing Home Compare, and there'll be a little bit more information on Nursing Home Compare upcoming. But primarily, the 4 reasons are to give consumers information about the quality of care, to help them choose a nursing home or skilled nursing facility, to understand the data related to common conditions in the nursing home SNF populations, to facilitate discussions with nursing home SNF staff regarding quality, and to give nursing home or skilled nursing facility staff data to support the quality improvement efforts. So in summary, you've learned about all 11 SNF QRP QMs and at least know where to find information to support the information that you've learned today, the key components of each quality measure and how they're used to calculate the quality measure, and the data submission deadlines and reporting timelines for fiscal year 2020 and subsequent years. So we'd like you to take a minute to record some action plans and ideas that you have based on what you heard here today, and to please add your questions to Slido and like those questions that you see that others have posted. And I want to thank you for your time and attention for a subject that is near and dear to my heart and hopefully near and dear to yours, to improve the quality of care in our skilled nursing facilities. Thank you so much.